So in Joshua 12, we find a list of 31 kings and their territories that were conquered. Now, why didn't God drive out all the inhabitants of Canaan all at once? Why do it gradually? Do you remember?
So the wild beast wouldn't take it over.
Yeah, because they didn't have enough population to occupy it. In fact, I want to actually go back and look at that verse, because there's a specific point I want to make from this verse in Deuteronomy 7. When you go back to Deuteronomy 7, this is where we find this verse. There's also a passage in Numbers about it too, I think, or maybe it's later in Deuteronomy. But anyway, I know there's another verse about the wild animals. But look in this passage in Deuteronomy 7. You'll see why I'm here in a second. Verse 22, the Lord your God will clear away these nations before you little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them quickly, for the wild beasts would grow too numerous for you. But the Lord your God will deliver them before you, and will throw them into great confusion until they are destroyed. He will deliver their kings into your hand, so that you make their name perish from under heaven. No man will be able to stand before you until you have destroyed them. So again, if they drove out the land too quickly, well, they didn't have a big enough population to spread out and populate the land. So a lot of the fields would not be fertile anymore, and things would kind of become desolate and overrun by wild animals. But based on this passage in Deuteronomy 7, why do you think Joshua 12 is included in Joshua? Did you catch what he said there in Deuteronomy 7? That relates to Joshua 12?
That as they go up against their enemies, that none will be able to stand against them until they've defeated them all.
Okay, that's true. That's the second part of the verse. So what's the first part of that verse? What's the promise? In verse 24, he says, he will deliver their kings into your hand. And when we read Joshua 12, we have a list of 31 kings that God delivered into their hands. So you're absolutely right, Terry. I was just trying to go a little bit further with that. More specifically, those that were not able to stand before them were the kings, were the rulers of these people. And so this is a really powerful reminder of the fulfillment of God's promises, not only in Deuteronomy 7, but all the way back to Abraham, giving them this land. He is the one true God. He keeps all those promises, and he not only defeats the kings, he defeats the gods of those kings, essentially. All of those kings, all of those nations would be serving Baal and the various deities, but Yahweh is superior. His people conquer the land because he fights for them. So this is just really a powerful passage, because we look at this list of kings and it may look dry, especially when we get to the next section. It may seem dry, all the details. But God is everywhere in these details. God is not just giving these things to us like, oh, wow. I really think they're going to be interested by a list of the names of kings. Like, how exciting. Well, no, it's not about our entertainment. It's about showing who he really is. So always look for God in these details that might seem mundane to us or might seem random to us. So that's Joshua 12. Any comments about that chapter? I just wanted to mention that in passing.
There is only one God.
Yeah.
And this, because as you say, these kings also worshiped a number of different gods. Mm-hmm. Each one that fell to the God that is.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Rahab, I wrote about this in the article, in the bulletin, that's what makes Rahab so impressive, because she essentially says, I don't trust my gods. I don't trust the gods of my territory to save me. I'm going to change gods. I'm going to change to your God, because he's the one true God. He's not even the God of her territory, but she changes gods because she has faith in Yahweh. It's really remarkable. And then, of course, the tragedy later of Israel changing gods too and leaving Yahweh for the gods of pagan prostitutes. So really, really remarkable. So let's get into the section that we mainly want to cover tonight, and that is from chapters 13 through 19. And what are these chapters primarily about?
Division of the land.
Yeah, the division of the land, or you might call it the allotment of the land, either way. And it's the allotment of the land of Canaan to the 12 tribes of Israel. And not just to the 12 tribes in general, but even to the individual families within the tribes. So it's not just a breaking up of the region, but God will sometimes give particular regions within the region, cities within the land to particular people and to particular families within that tribe. And these chapters really explain the maps that we have always seen at the back of our Bible, right? You turn to the back of your Bible, if you have maps, you're going to see something like this, where you have these allotments of the lands. Well, these geographical boundaries that are rendered in these artist renderings are based on the boundaries and borders given in these chapters in Joshua. So you can go back and research and actually look at the particular boundary geographical markers and chapters, and that's where they're getting those things from. Now, it's not perfect. We don't know the perfect boundaries, but we know pretty well because it's a very detailed account. Let me ask a couple questions about this allotment. First of all, why don't we see a tribe of Joseph? I mean, after all, he was one of the 12 sons of Israel.
He got the award of having a double proportion, which is Ephraim and Manasseh.
Yeah, good. So Joseph is actually represented there. But there's not a tribe of Joseph. It's actually his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And that's because, as Jack referenced, in Genesis 48, in verse 22, Joseph brings his sons to his father, Jacob, or Israel. And he wants him to bless his two sons. And he does that. But remember, he actually switches the blessing. And he gives Ephraim the greater blessing than Manasseh, even though Ephraim was the younger one. It should have gone to Manasseh, but he actually switches his hands. And then at the end of that, he tells Joseph, you, Joseph, will have one more portion than your brothers. You will have a double portion. Now, who should that double portion have gone to?
To the oldest.
Yeah, the oldest, the firstborn, who was Reuben. But when you read Genesis, Reuben really messes up a bunch of times. And so does Simeon and Levi, and so does Judah. And you just compare the brothers to the faith of Joseph and how the whole latter part of Genesis is devoted to Joseph because he's just such a man of God. He's such a faithful man. It makes sense why he would be given a double portion. And so Joseph's double portion is represented by his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Here's another question. Why don't we see a tribe of Levi?
They didn't get any land.
Okay, it's the priestly tribe, but where's their land?
There's cities. They got cities.
Yeah, they get cities. And we're going to talk more about that on Sunday, but I do want us to look at Joshua 13 real quick. Joshua 13, a couple places we could go to look at this. We're going to get into the main discussion of the Levites on Sunday, Lord willing.
Well, Manasseh actually got double, right? I thought you said Ephraim got.
Well, okay, you're talking about size-wise?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, size-wise, Manasseh was bigger. Fertility-wise, Ephraim had a more fertile land.
Better land.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know that would be a part of the blessing. Just the fact that there's more amount of people. Maybe that's a blessing. Maybe that's a curse. I don't know. So I have no idea either. That's a good question. That's a good thought.
We like to have the land that's got water.
Okay, yeah, I mean, sure. So look at, where was I? Joshua 13, verse 14. Joshua 13, verse 14. Only to the tribe of Levi he did not give an inheritance. The offerings by fire to the Lord, the God of Israel, are their inheritance, as he spoke to him. So their inheritance was the priesthood. Their inheritance was their close relationship with God. And again, we're going to talk more on that Sunday, so I don't want to spoil too much about that. But that's why you don't look at a map and see, oh, here's a tribe of Levi, because they actually received cities all throughout the tribes, spread out.
Because that's where they would be as they served all of these tribes.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk more on Sunday, so you're baiting me. I want to talk more on that, Bill. You're tempting me to talk more, but I'm going to keep it closed because I don't want to get too far into the Levites. But let's talk about an overview of these chapters because, there's 7 chapters we have to cover. So that's a lot. There's no way we're going to get into the details. But we can look at some overview things and some big picture things. And what you see is in chapter 13, you have the Transjordan allotment. So you have the allotment of the land to the east of the Jordan, which would be Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. Now, the truth is, all of those allotments were already assigned by who?
Moses.
Yeah, Moses. Look in Joshua 13, if you're still there, of course, in verse 8. Verse 8, with the other half tribe, the Reubenites and Gadites received their inheritance, which Moses gave them, beyond the Jordan to the east, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave to them. And that's actually repeated like 5 times in this chapter. It just continually reminds them, oh, Moses already gave them. Because, again, it's emphasizing the fulfillment of promises. God made that promise to them through Moses. God is going to keep his promises. So that's what's happening. Now, Joshua's job and the priest, Eleazar's job, is to make sure that the 9.5 other tribes get their portions allotted to them west of the Jordan. That's what they're going to have to do, and that's what we see in these following chapters. Because in chapter 14, Caleb gets his portion of the land. Chapter 15, Judah actually, and Caleb is from Judah, but it focuses on Caleb first, and then it goes to Judah, the whole, as a tribe as a whole. And then chapter 16, Ephraim, and there's that preeminence, part of the preeminence. Ephraim actually is allotted first before Manasseh. It's kind of interesting there. And then Manasseh in chapter 17, along with the daughters of Zelophehad, which they were of the tribe of Manasseh. And you remember the daughters of Zelophehad? I always have to look at that, make sure I'm saying it right. Where do we see them before? You remember, not necessarily, you don't have to give it a chapter, but just the book maybe.
In the wandering.
Okay, yeah, in the book of Numbers, right? And they had a lot of faith because their father had no son. They were all women, and so they were concerned that they wouldn't receive an inheritance, that their land would be given to someone else. But that was a very faithful thing because they trusted, long before they entered Canaan, that God was actually going to give them the land. So they said, look, when we get the land, we just want to make sure we get some of it. And God actually fulfills that promise and gives the land to the daughters of Zelophehad there. And then chapter 18, you have Benjamin, and then chapter 19, it fills in the rest with Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, and Joshua gets his land individually as well at the end of chapter 19. Here's a question. Why is there so much material? This is what I want to spend some time developing. Why so much material devoted to this? I mean, couldn't there have been just a nice little summary and everybody got their land? All right, let's move on. Why the almost tedious? I mean, when we're reading it, we're thinking, okay, the border's here, and this is south, and here's the western side, and this is and it's just so specific. It's so detailed. And he spends, of course, they didn't have chapter divisions, but by our chapter divisions, 7 chapters on describing all of this. God tells us all Scripture is profitable, but how is it profitable to know all of these things? What does this section teach us about God?
That he does what he says he's going to do.
Good. This is working great so far because you said the first one that I had listed. So good. Yeah. Elaborate on that.
Well, really, God, and that was the plan that he had for these people forever.
Yeah.
And basically, part of it was so that not one or another would have all or a larger portion, but God determined what they had.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been over 400 years, and God is making good on the promise that he made to Abraham and the promise that he's been making to them repeatedly, to Abraham's descendants. I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to bring this land. And now he does so. And then Bill is on a roll tonight because he made my second point as well, that it shows that God is the one giving them the land. How are they deciding who gets what portion?
Terry. Lot.
Yeah, by lot. Hey, look in Joshua 14. Joshua 14, verses 1 and 2. Joshua 14, verses 1 and 2. Now these are the territories which the sons of Israel inherited in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the households of the tribes of the sons of Israel apportioned to them for an inheritance by the lot of their inheritance, as the Lord commanded through Moses for the 9 tribes and the half tribe. And then when you look at the first verse in a lot of these chapters, like chapter 15, verse 1, chapter 15, verse 1, now the lot for the tribe of the sons of Judah, and then he explains that. God had already told Moses how this is going to work. Look in Numbers 33 real quick. Numbers 33. Because, when we think of the word lot, we just think, well, it's just a lot of land. I mean, this is a lot that they're going to be living on. Well, the word lot has a specific reference, probably to some form of stone that they would cast that would somehow enable them to distinguish the will of God. So look in Numbers 33, verse 54. Numbers 33, verse 54, he says, you shall inherit the land by lot according to your families. To the larger you shall give more inheritance, and to the smaller you shall give less inheritance. Wherever the lot falls to anyone, that shall be his. You shall inherit according to the tribes of your fathers. So there's this language of wherever the lot falls, which is hard to understand because we just don't know much about how it worked when they cast lots to identify whose tribe would get what. But there's an interesting verse in Proverbs 16:33 that says the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So it's not like they're just rolling the dice and maybe luckily I get this land. Well, no, God is in control of this somehow. I'm just not 100% sure. I wish I knew how the casting of lots worked there. But the point overall is God is the one giving them this land. The land is divinely divided because it's divinely provided. In other words, this whole section should not just point us to geography. It should point us to the God who's giving them this geography.
Providence.
Yeah, absolutely. The providence of God. Very good. Let me make some... Well, we're doing well, so maybe I'll ask you, because I was afraid if I asked you all, I have 5 things. I was afraid I'd get, God keeps his promises last, and it'd be in a totally different order, and then I wouldn't be able to click and all that. But we're doing pretty well. Anybody have any other ideas? Why this section is here? Why would God spend so much detail and be so specific about the allotment of this land? What else does that serve? Bonnie?
Well, later on in the Old Testament, they have different battles and judges, and it kind of helps you understand where the tribe was that was maybe fighting. I remember Dan, and they had some problems and everything.
Okay, so just from a practical Bible study standpoint, when we look in the future about these various battles and kings and all that, it helps us to know, oh, well, that's where this is taking place. Okay, yeah, that's one I hadn't thought of. Joe?
Well, these are real people. We read about them and we don't know them, and God cares for them. So that's what they would ask, and that's what we would ask. What's the boundaries and stuff. So it's not just something that he just said, hey, you got to go figure it out and stuff like that. Because where's your house at? You know where your house is.
Right.
You know where your lots are and stuff like that.
Okay, so let me go there because you're on track with where I was wanting to go with that. What if God were to say, "Oh, you guys just figured it out"? No, millions of people. They would be at war with one another, wouldn't they?
It'd be a big war.
Yeah, it'd be a bloodbath among the Israelites because, well, no, this is my land. Well, no, I saw it first. No, well, I set my foot, my donkey went over there first. It would be an absolute disaster. But God prevents all that, and he promotes peace and unity among his people by telling them ahead of time, this is where you're going to live. There is no question. There's not, there's no complaining. There's no jealousy. Well, how come they got... You be content because it's given to you by the grace of God. Your portion in the land is a gift. And you're not to be jealous of other people's lands. You're not to fight for other people's land. You're not to steal other people's lands. You're not even to put them in, dire financial situations so that they'll be forced to sell their land to you. And it's also very specific. God didn't want there to be any confusion about where they live. He provided great clarity here. In fact, do you remember, here's a great example of this. Do you remember in 1 Kings 21 when the wicked king Ahab asked Naboth to sell him his vineyard? Why did Naboth refuse? You remember why he refused?
It wasn't his to sell.
Okay, well, yeah, yes and no, right? It was his vineyard, but
Yeah.
he said it was the inheritance of my
It was,
fathers.
but that's the thing, you couldn't sell off that which was already given.
Yeah, and that's the thing. God did not want his people selling off their land. Now, sometimes people would actually make poor financial decisions and they would put themselves in a position where they did have to sell their land because they were in so much debt up to their eyeballs, they couldn't handle it. But then what happened every 50th year in the year of Jubilee?
It all went back.
Yes. All debts are forgiven and all land reverts back to its original owner. So God wanted this land to be a very, very long inheritance, right? He wanted them to keep this land from generation to generation to generation, and just pass it down to your son, and pass it down to your child, and pass it down to your child. This is our land. This is our allotment. And I think that ultimately what that does, when God promotes peace and unity, it provides security, too, for his people to worship him, to not be afraid and looking over their shoulder and worried about people encroaching on their property. They can just be the holy people of God without fear because God already established this land. Let me make a couple more points about this. It also shows God has the right to remove them because it's his land.
And he did.
And he did. He has the right to say, I'm going to set conditions on you. You can live in this land as long as you meet these conditions. You keep my law. You do my will. You be holy, for I am holy. And if you don't meet these conditions, I can expel you from the land. And guess what? They had no basis to complain about that because it wasn't their land. It was God's land. That's a really powerful thing to remember when we do see in future history, they do get kicked out of their land.
Well,
And some might want to blame God, but the prophets are saying, look, you can't blame God. How long have we been telling you since Moses? We've been telling you to follow the law, otherwise you'll be booted from the land. And yet they continue to disobey. Go ahead,
The whole Bible back then was about this situation.
Yeah.
Where he would remove them from the land because they had left him.
Yeah, that was one of the major things in the blessings and curses section of the law. In the curse section, one of those is, I will give you up to foreign powers. I'll bring in stronger nations, and they will remove you from this beautiful land. You'll no longer have that blessing. And it's always that way with God. He does bless us. He's very gracious, but he also sets conditions. And he has the right to do that even for our salvation. He has the right to say, well, if you want to be saved, you need to be baptized. And we can complain about that and say, well, I don't think that's right. I don't need to do that. But it's not your salvation. It's only our salvation because God is letting us have it. So in order to get it, we have to get it on his terms. So there's a lot of application there. And then finally, let me just make this point. God actually allots them land that hasn't been defeated yet. In Joshua 13:1, look what it says there. This is one of my favorite verses just because it's kind of funny. Verse 1. Joshua 13:1. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years when the Lord said to him, you are old and advanced in years. and very much of this land remains to be possessed. It's just a funny way to write that. But it's for emphasis.
Are you making fun of the Holy Spirit?
I'm not. I think the Holy Spirit perhaps has a sense of humor, and we're designed in the image of God, and so I'm okay with saying that. But it is interesting there that what he says at the end of that verse, after we get past the distraction of maybe the humor of the first part, very much of the land remains to be possessed. Okay, so what I want you to see is chapters 13 through 19, all of these tribal allotments is way bigger than what they conquered in Joshua 12 and the 31 kings and the city-states and all that. And what that shows is victory is assured. You don't have it yet, but it's as good as yours. I'm going to go ahead and allot it to you anyway because you just have to have faith in me and you'll conquer it. So it's really powerful how God just sets all that out for them. Let me make a couple applications and I'll open up for comments. Let me just say, God does not bless with the bare minimum. Some of you have kind of alluded to that. I think Joe kind of alluded to that. God could have just said, okay, here's the land. Well, now you can't accuse me of not keeping my promises. But he did so much more than just give them the land. He fought for them. He gave them a plan for how to get the land. He gave them a plan for how to keep the land. He made sure they didn't drive out the inhabitants too quickly. He spent just meticulous detail on assigning the geographical borders of the land. I mean, he just goes above and beyond. I'm reminded of Ephesians 3:20, where it says that God is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think. And it really is true. He doesn't seek to just bless us with the bare minimum that we need to just get along in life. He abundantly gives us grace through the Lord Jesus Christ. And it's really, really an amazing thing about the God that we serve. And let me say this too. God has blessed us with our unique portions of talent in the church. In fact, when Paul talks about the roles we play in the church in Romans 12, he actually says, quote, at least in the New American Standard, God has allotted to each a measure of faith. That means we all can be content with the kind of person God has made us, the talents that he's given us, the allotment that we have in the church, so that we don't have to be jealous of our brethren. We don't have to try to steal things that don't belong to us from our brethren. We can just be content in knowing God has given us great blessings, and he's blessed us beyond what we're able to even think or ask. Any comments or questions so far on any of that? Terry?
So not only does he assure victory for within the boundaries, but I think that you would also apply that to if you go outside these boundaries, you might not necessarily be blessed, or maybe he doesn't have your back if you try to do more than what he's told you.
Okay, maybe so, yeah. That maybe what Terry's saying is there are some limits to the victory God is going to give them. God is not saying, well, I'm going to give you the entire world, so you can leave Canaan and you can go conquer the universe. It's like, well, no, he does set some limit, and there's maybe some hint about that later when Manasseh comes to Joshua complaining that they're not really happy with the amount of land that they have. And there seems to be a measure of discontentment in their attitude, and they're bragging. We're this great big people. We need more land. And Joshua just kind of says, "Well, then go get it. Just quit whining and go. Trust the Lord and go fight." So yeah, maybe there is some of that as well. We need to be content with what we've been given, and not try to get more than what we need. Matt.
Kind of two things that I was thinking as he's talking about promoting the peace and unity and structure, and I was thinking, well, kind of like our kids, sometimes we'd say, this is yours, like it's just because it's the best way to do it. Mm-hmm. And I had this vision of like a pile of Christmas presents that were unwrapped, and you just say, oh guys, figure it out.
Oh man, yeah.
They're going to fight about
That'd be a violent Christmas.
But then the application I thought was, for us, we see this through the whole Bible. Pattern, organization, details, they matter, and God has a way he wants things done. He wants it done in order, peacefully.
Yeah.
And, you can't it's not just like, yeah, just love me, it's fine, whatever. Like, he wants things done. Sometimes he tells us the specifics. They're in the Bible. Mm-hmm. If we read them, we know how to do it, and it matters. Absolutely.
God is a God of order and pattern, and you see that even in the New Testament. A lot of Christians today want to say, well, God just does away with all the order and stuff in the New Testament. No, that's not true. It's just a different kind of order. Let's see, Adam and then Bill.
Just one thought came to my mind when you were talking about the fact that the land was already pretty much reserved for them. It was already allotted to them before they had it. Maybe think of 1 Peter chapter 1, where Peter talks about the living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead to obtain an inheritance which is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. So awesome. We're not there yet. We don't have it yet, but it's like, all right, this is your allotment, this is your inheritance, and it's waiting for you. You just need to keep fighting.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, that's a really good point. Heaven is waiting for us. Our victory is assured already. It's just we have to go through the trials of this life and fight off the Canaanites and all that stuff, in order to fully inherit that promise. Good point, Bill.
It sounded to me like you said God has given each of us certain skills and abilities.
True, true.
Now, does that mean that each of us has to act on that which the Lord has given us, whatever, and how
I think so.
part of what we are?
Yeah.
Does that mean, is that?
Yeah, I think so. The parable of the talents, God gives us these gifts and these blessings, and then He
you're
expects us to
supposed
use them for His glory.
And not hide them in the sand.
Yeah, that's a great thought. Really good points, everybody. Really appreciate that. Let's keep going, because did you notice there's a bookend at the start of chapter 14 and the end of chapter 19 with Caleb and Joshua? I think that's significant for a couple of reasons. One, to show that, again, that God kept His promises to these two men. Remember, of all of the men, 20 years and older, they were the only two people who survived the wilderness wanderings. And God promised them because of their faithfulness, because they brought back the good report and they did not allow the unfaithfulness of the Israelites to rub off on them. God promised them that I will preserve you. Everybody else is going to die, but I'm going to preserve the two of you and give you land. And so you see a fulfillment of that promise here. A more subtle point, I think this is also what's going on here in this text, is that if the Israelites want to keep the land and keep having victory in the land, they need to live like Caleb and Joshua. I think this is, the writer gives us vignettes of faith. Look in Joshua 14, verse 6. Oh man, we're running a little low on time to do all that reading. Listen to what Caleb says. Let's drop down to verse 10. Joshua 14, verse 10. Now behold, the Lord has let me live, just as He spoke these 45 years from the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses, when Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I'm 85 years old today. I'm still as strong today as I was on the day Moses sent me. And as my strength was then, so my strength is now for war and for going out and coming in. Now then, give me this hill country, about which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day that Anakim were there, with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out, as the Lord has spoken. Now, I picked up in an unfortunate spot because it sounded a lot like Caleb was being very arrogant there. But in the verses preceding, he talks all about how this is based on God's promises. He's not basing this on his own strength. He's basing it on the promises of God. And then if you turn to chapter 15, listen to what happens, verse 13. Chapter 15, 13. He gave Caleb the son of Jephunneh a portion among the sons of Judah, according to the command of the Lord to Joshua, namely Kiriath Arba, Arba being the father of Anak. Caleb drove out from there the three sons of Anak, verse 15. Then he went up from there against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name Debir was formerly Kiriath Sefer. And then he continues on to talk about Caleb's success here. And then Joshua is the same way in chapter 19. So these are success stories in this passage. And look in Joshua 19. I actually do want to point out this verse. Joshua 19, verse 50. Joshua 19, verse 50. In accordance with the command of the Lord, they gave Joshua the city for which he asked Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. So he built the city and settled in it. Now, when you did your reading at home, you probably noticed contrasts to Caleb and Joshua's example in the chapters in between those bookends. For instance, look in Joshua 15, verse 63. Joshua 15, verse 63. Now, as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah could not drive them out. So the Jebusites lived with the sons of Judah at Jerusalem until this day. Look in chapter 16 and verse 10. But they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites live in the midst of Ephraim to this day, and they became forced laborers. And you see in chapter 17, you see in chapter 18, all of these reports about how they failed to drive out the Canaanites, in contrast to Joshua and Caleb, who succeeded. And this all serves as a very foreboding sign for the future, because the problem of the Israelites allowing the Canaanites to stick around and not fully drive them out is going to be the heart of the issue during the period of the Judges. Because remember, God didn't just want the Canaanites destroyed because of their sinfulness and as justice for their sin. He also didn't want them influencing His people and turning the hearts of His people away from Him. And so as they leave this wicked influence in the land and fail to do what they're supposed to do, they're setting themselves up for failure down the road. And sadly, it's going to come back to haunt them big time. And they won't actually take possession. Think about this. They won't actually take possession of the land to the full extent of God's promise to Abraham until after the end of David's reign, which means another 400 years from what we're reading right now. That's not supposed to happen. It's supposed to happen much quicker. But again, they've got to wait 400 years to actually inherit the land that was specifically described to Abraham because they leave the Canaanites here in the land. We're going to read a lot more about that in Judges, but we get little hints of that here that kind of sets that up for us so we understand what's going to happen later. So let me make a couple applications and I'll leave it open for comments. First of all, small areas of neglect can become big problems later. Don't neglect what seem to be small commands of God or things that don't seem like they have very big consequences right now. We can often just kind of ignore those things, but they will catch up to us. Our sin will find us out. Hang on, Bill, hang on, I got to get through this. We may not feel the effects of these things right now, but they will get the better of us and haunt us. And secondly, don't get comfortable in your fight against Satan. Keep conquering. Keep moving forward. I think that's part of what happened. They got in this land and they said, man, this is kind of nice. I don't think we need to go any further. I don't think we need to keep driving the Canaanites out. I mean, I got a pretty nice place here. This is a nice blessing. I don't think I need any more. And they get complacent. And God says, no, you actually need to keep going. You need to stay vigilant in this fight. Just like Tom said in an excellent invitation last Wednesday, there is no neutral ground when you're fighting Satan. The minute we stop fighting and we get comfortable, that's the minute Satan is winning in our lives. But if we trust the Lord and we keep pressing on and conquering Satan every day, the victory is assured and that eternal inheritance is waiting for us. Comments or questions about any of that? That's all I had for class, so the rest is yours for comments or questions.
I have a question.
Okay.
How did you get through class and leave time for discussion?
Well,
How did you do
I
that?
didn't, really. not much anyway. I had 28 seconds I left, so. And they fell in the silence. I appreciate that. Thank you all very much. Read through page 48 of your book for Sunday, and we'll talk about the Levites and their allotment of cities in the land.